Hello everyone, welcome. Welcome to the Papernest Dolls Retreat. I'm super excited to be joining you guys here virtually. I know you guys are in some classes right now, but I'm just popping in really quick to do this live so that you guys can reference the video when you want to create this project. So my card that I'm going to be showing you guys to create today is using the beautiful Mermaid Ellie with Seahorse. See right here, I'm going to be showing you how to color her up, how to do a really fun ocean scene background, and also how to add embellishments and layers. You can see our card here has lots of different layers. I love layering all of my cards. And the stamp we're featuring here is the Mermaid L with Seahorse. So this is the one right here, this rubber stamp. In your kits, I created for you guys little baggies. It should have come like this, and then also has the pre-stamped image for you. We're going to start first blending the background for the tutorial because this part takes a little bit of time to dry. So we're going to do that first. Then I'm going to show you guys how to color up the image. Then we will assemble the card. Okay, so let's get started with this first base layer. I'm just going to move this aside to the back. You're going to open your package here. Be really careful because there's some little teeny tiny pearls and like little beads and stuff, and you don't want those to fall out. So be really careful when opening this up and don't just dump everything out. I'm going to just remove this first watercolor paper piece right there. Hi Christine, welcome. And then you're also going to remove, you can see here I have this little sequin tape that I added into everybody's kits. We're going to use this as a little stencil. So this is going to create bubbles. So you can reuse this. So do not throw this away after we use it this one time. You can keep reusing this over and over and over again for making underwater scenes as a stencil. So I'm just going to set this aside. We're going to be using both of these for the background. And then we can go ahead and close this up so that none of the little pieces fall out. Hello everyone, welcome. Hi Yvora, hopefully I said your name correctly. If I did not, I apologize. But hello, welcome, thank you for joining me. Okay, so here we go. You're going to take the watercolor paper. On the list I shared with you guys, we're going to be using a few Oxide inks for the background. Oh, no worries, Christine. Thank you for popping in and saying hi. We're going to be using Peacock Feathers Distress Oxide. If you don't have these Distress Oxides, just pick a blue one and pick a purple tone. That's all you need. So I'm going to be using the Distress Oxide and Peacock Feathers, Distress Ink in Wilted Violet, and Chipped Sapphire Distress Ink. So those are the three inks I'm going to be using for this blending of the background. You're also going to need some either white acrylic paint or a white gesso, so that's what I'm using here. Or you could use like white watercolor, white ink of any type, and you could use a blending sponge, but you just need something you can help make the texture of the bubbles over our blended background. Okay, so we're going to take this little one here. We're going to be using some blending sponges. I'm going to start off with my Peacock Feathers. You're just going to get a blending sponge and we're just going to load it up with the Distress Oxide. And I'm going to be blending this upper left-hand corner first. So I'm going to start off my mat and be going in small circular motions, just like this, so we don't get any hard edges, and blending towards the middle. I'm doing a diagonal here. So just this top edge, we're going to have the inside part of this ocean to be lit up, just like, you know, when you're looking at underwater scenes, underwater animation, you have it illuminating in the center, so that's what we're mirroring here. So we're going to build up color, small circular motions with the blending sponge. If you don't have blending sponges like this, you could use a makeup sponge, you could use a makeup blending brush. And again, just blending this along this top edge and leaving the center and this right edge with the watercolor paper. We're going to do one more layer just along the edge. You want kind of a deeper tone, lighter, and then blending to the white. Okay, so now we're going to switch to our purple. We're going to just leave this open though because we're still going to use this ink. We're going to be switching to the Wilted Violet with the blending sponge. Again, just loading up our blending sponge here. And I just picked a different blending sponge. We don't want to use the same one, otherwise it's going to blend the two colors together. And now I'm going to be, so if you think of this like lines going across, I'm just going to be blending in a diagonal on this bottom corner to mirror this diagonal. So I'm starting with small circular motions on this bottom right edge and blending up towards the center, but kind of making it just kind of go like circular a little bit, but not closing that line on the bottom and the top corner. So again, the same thing I did with the other side. I'm just going to add a few layers of this color. And again, this is Wilted Violet. If you do not have Wilted Violet, you can use any purple ink as long as it's water activated, because we're going to be using that feature to get some more little texture in the ocean. So again, small circular motions, building up the color, deepening that color edge so it's a little bit darker on that very edge. And by starting off the mat and then going onto the mat, or I mean onto your die cut, it helps from getting any of those harsh lines. So just like that. Okay, so now we have those two colors blended. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our little stencil here, so this little sequin tape, and we're just going to place it right over the edge, and we're going to use the same colors we just did, and we're going to blend them right over again. But this time I'm going to be using some blending brushes. These really get in nice into the details of stencils, and they're gentle on it, so that's why I like using that. And so I'm just going to load up this with that same Wilted Violet. And I am just going to blend in small circular motions again, just right on top of the area I already did with the purple. And building up that color mostly along the edge, we're just adding a little bit of texture. You could tape this down if you're worried about it shifting. It doesn't need to be perfect. We just want to give this little bit of bubble texture. Okay, and then we can remove that, and you can see it added just a tiny bit of texture there. Now we're going to do the same thing on this opposite side, but with the chipped sapphire. The distress in peacock feathers doesn't really go quite contrast enough, so we're going to go ahead and switch to the chipped sapphire, and we're going to grab a blending brush just like we did before. Oh, thank you, Carrie. Thank you. So again, just using the chipped sapphire, loading up the blending brush, and then just shifting our little makeshift stencil, and then we're just going to blend right over our peacock feathers color. And again, small circular motions, blend a little bit into the white area, and concentrate on the edge being a little bit darker, more concentration of color. And again, if you're worried about it shifting, tape it down. Okay, so now we can go ahead and remove this. And you can see now we have that really fun texture from both sides with our little makeshift stencil. Now what we're going to do is we're going to activate this ink. Since this is distress ink, I'm just going to take a little toothbrush, old toothbrush with some water on it. I'm just going to spritz it right off camera really quick so I don't get water droplets all over our workspace. I always spritz it 2 or 3 times just so I get a variation of spritzes. I don't have to worry about it not looking too uniform. So now I'm just going to dab that up with a rag, or you could use a paper towel to pull up those little water droplets. Just cleaning off our workspace real quick. Okay, so now this is where we're going to take that same stencil we just used. And we're going to take our white acrylic gesso or acrylic paint, white ink, whatever you have on hand. And we're going to use the same thing with the stencil. We're just going to shift it slightly so it's not the same pattern as our other bubbles. This is going to create a really fun mixed media look. So just shifting it slightly, and I'm going to just do a little bit here on this upper edge and then the bottom edge as well. I'm going to take a palette knife. You could also use like an old credit card for this technique. And I'm just going to get a little bit of this gesso on the palette knife. You could also use like a glitter gloss if you don't have the gesso. And then you're just going to just add it with your palette knife right on top. And just like a mixed media way, you're just going to kind of randomly add it to the corner. Just getting a little bit more. And that's why we're doing this first too, because this gesso is going to take a few minutes to dry. You could use a heat gun to it as well if you needed it to dry quick. Okay, so just a little bit of texture there. I'm going to go ahead and move this. And you can see now we have that extra fun layer. I'm going to quickly just clean that up with a little wet wipe. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing on this bottom edge. So again, just using our same little makeshift stencil. And we're repeating the process, just grabbing some of our gesso, white paint, and then just adding it to this bottom edge. You could also, if you had glitter sprays, you could just spritz it with glitter spray a couple times and would still give you that texture if you didn't want to do this with the gesso or the white ink. So just adding it right across. Making sure I get all the way to the edge though. I don't want it to not go on the edge wherever I have it start from. Okay, so once we're done with that, make sure it's smooth across the top. You just remove your little stencil. And then we have that fun pattern there. And remember, save your little stencil because these are completely reusable. I just use a little wet wipe to wipe it off with. You could also rinse it if you have time, but it's totally reusable. It's a little metal. This is actually the piece that they cut sequins out of. So this was just the leftover that they throw away after they cut out sequins. And that's what we're using as our little stencil here. So there we go. So now we're going to set this aside to dry while we're doing our coloring. And I'm just going to quickly just clean up our workspace here. You do not want to let the gesso dry on it, otherwise it's going to be really hard to get off. Also, if you have stencils you are using, you want to wash them off too and not just leave them to dry, because then it will be difficult to get that off later. Okay, so now we can get started on our coloring. I pre-stamped out the image for all of you guys. Thank you. And we are going to be using the colors that were listed for you. I'm going to start off with her skin first. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more so you guys can really see the coloring as we go. Okay, so for when I'm coloring images, I always start off with the skin. We're going to color her up like this with the bright pink hair going into this turquoise. We're going to be matching her little tail, and then we're going to be using purples for her seahorse. So we're going to start with her skin. You're going to be using E04 for the shadows. I will also list all these colors down below if you guys forgot to write them down. Same thing with the stamp I used and the distress inks. Okay, so I'm going to add the first little details. Inside her little ears, I always like to make a little line for her ears. So I just add that in. Then I'm going to be going around the edge of her hair here and just adding our shadow under her hairline. And again, this is with E04, pulling the shadow around where her hair is there, underneath her ears, and then along the side of her face on the right and left side. But I'm not going all the way underneath her chin there. I'm just going along the edges of her face. And then here on the neck, I'm going to go a little bit further under her neckline there, and then same thing on the other side, but still not connecting it all the way. There's still a tiny little part of that white still showing through. We want this line to have movement, so that's why you don't want to color it all just straight across all the lines. When you give some areas where the light hits harder and then other areas where it's more shadow, it gives more interest to your piece. So there on the top of the shoulders, we're going to add a small little detail to the underneath of her hand here. It's a little shadow line, and then pulling her wrist in on either side. We're going to do that with her other wrist too, just in her hand. We're just adding those little shadows. Then the underneath part of her arm, she's going to have a shadow. We're imagining that the light is coming in from the ocean up above. So up here coming down. So that's why we're trying to place all these lights and shadows in that same mapping area. So here underneath her little swimsuit shells, you're going to have a cast shadow. So we're just adding those in. And then on the same thing on the other side, and then anything that is overlapping her body is going to cast a shadow. So we have the seahorse here adding a shadow to her from above. So we're just going to add this little shadow so it pushes her back and then the seahorse forward. We're going to add a shadow where the top part of her fins, her mermaid tail is overlapping her stomach there. And then same thing on this opposite side. Once we get all of our shadows mapped, the rest of the coloring will go really, really smoothly and easily. Here on the inside crease of her arm, you'd have a little bit of a shadow where it folds. And then on the side of the shell, okay, I think we have all of our the main shadows. So now we're going to move on to the next color in our lineup. And that was E04. Now I'm moving to E11. And I'm going to start coloring over these lines. I'm going to be coloring sideways. I'm not going to be flicking into the color yet because these are my two base shadows for this color blend. So here on the hand, I'm just going to pull right across using the side of my marker and pulling right across that shadow area. And you can go over a couple of times if you feel like it needs to be a smoother blend. So again, just pulling across our shadows that we just did. I'm cleaning my marker sometimes in between. You'll notice that I'll start cleaning it off. You can see that little dot of darker color there. Anytime you go from a darker color to a lighter color, your lighter color can pick up and transfer some of that darker color. So especially when we're getting into the lighter shades or the highlight areas, I'm going to be making a habit of cleaning my marker off in between going over those areas. Otherwise, it takes a lot to blend out a smear of, a darker shadow color right across your highlight. Okay, so again, pulling this color towards the next, just kind of going over on the side of my marker, blending these two colors together, these two shadow colors, going over multiple times to make that a smooth blend. Same thing with the hand. The top of her shoulder here, underneath her neckline, and on the inside part of her swimsuit where this little shell is overlapping. Here on her upper shoulder. And then here where her little ear is, and then following through on her hairline. Some of these areas are really small to color, like her little ears, but we still want to pull this colors through. So that's why on these I'm really just dotting. I'm doing like one or two little dots to add that color. To add that color where the shadow is. So here when I was doing her hairline, so I was out of camera view for a second, all I'm doing is just going right across like that. Just blending sideways across our shadow areas. Same thing here on her chin and around the side of her face. I'm just going to pull this color sideways right across our shadow. And again, if it's a small area, I'm just dotting on the bottom portion of it. Here along this side of her cheek. I'm going over a couple of times to really get a good blend on this color. Just like that. Okay, so again, that was E11. Now I'm going to move on to our next color in the lineup, which is going to be E21. Right there. And we're going to just do the same thing. We're going to be coloring sideways, going across. the image here. So here with her hand, holding across like this. So always with E04, E11, and E21, I blend sideways. Then once I get to my E00 next, that's when we'll start flicking into the center of our image. So again, just pulling this color sideways, blending out, following my previous shading from before. Underneath her neckline. And if you feel it needs more blending, go over a couple of times the same way. Around the side of her face, around her chin. And then make sure you get her hand there too. And then the opposite hand, just pulling that color through. Okay, so that was E21. Now we're going to move on to E00. Now this is where we're going to start pulling this shading towards the center of her face. So E00, we are going to take this, and where this shadow layer is, you're going to go halfway between your darkest part of the shadow and where your shadow ends. And that is where we're going to start our flicking from. So we're going to go like this, and we're going to flick this color. We're coloring on the side of our marker, and then just flicking this color towards the middle. And you can go over a couple of times to blend it out, but that is what we're doing all the way around. So I'm going to start turning my page as we go so I can continue the same type of blending. It's easier for me to flick away from myself, so that's why I'm turning the paper like this. You do whatever is comfortable for you. So again, just flicking this color towards the center, going over a couple of times for a good smooth blend. And again, this is E00. Okay, and now we're going to be doing her stomach and then her shoulders, so we're just going to pull this color towards the center, still trying to keep a small little white highlight of the paper there. So some of these little flicking areas will be really teeny tiny, so we can still maintain that highlight. Same thing with her hand, pulling that color on the underneath side there, and then also on her arm, and then the top of her neck here. And that was E00. And again, I'm just going over some of these areas a couple of times to build up that color if I feel it needs to be a smoother blend between the previous color. Okay, so now we're going to move on to E000. Right here, we're going to do the same exact thing. We are going to be just going right where, halfway between where we did our our first shadow and our end line. So it's about right here, and this is where I'm going to pull this side flicking from towards the center of her face. If you feel like you need to deepen the contrast, you go over it multiple times, flicking from the same spot. If you pull right from the very edge where you finished, you're going to end up with a little gutter line that goes around that's really hard to blend out. And if you blend too far where your darker shadow is, you're going to pull that shadow through the rest of your coloring. So that's why you want to go about halfway. So again, just blending that out, still leaving a tiny highlight of the paper in the center. I'm coloring on the side of my marker so I can get broad blending sections. So again, on her arm, still leaving a tiny bit of highlight on the top portion of her arms and her hand, mostly blending out the bottom edge when it's a tiny little area. And then her stomach, I'm doing the same thing. I'm flicking from the side all the way around and leaving just a tiny bit of the white of the paper there. And then on her hand, I'm just blending out the bottom edge. Because it is such a small area, I want to still keep a tiny bit of highlight. Okay, so that was E000. And then lastly, I'm going to blend all of this area right through the highlight with E0000. I just refilled my colorless blender, so this is actually not colorless blender. This is refilled with this right here, Floral White. So all I'm going to do is make sure my marker's cleaned off, because this is the part where you could definitely transfer that color through. Then I'm just going to blend right over that highlight. And if you need it blended down to match and coordinate more with your coloring, you can go over it multiple times. You can always build your color, but it is very hard to take it away. And then dotting over her ears there, her hand. Okay, so this is the first layer of color for the skin tone. On my skin tones, I always go darkest to lightest, then lightest to darkest. So now we did our first part in our color ladder, so now we're going to go back up the color ladder. So I just did the E0000. Now I'm going to move back to E000, and I'm just going to go right over the areas I just did. Always this second layer of color really makes your coloring come alive. I'm only coloring the same spots that I did with the previous time. So we're still keeping an eye on our highlights. We're not coloring these colors in sections that we didn't the first time. You're just adding another layer of color to those areas. So that was E000. Now we're moving up to E00. So again, just flicking this color from the center. Remember, we did the flicking technique for the E00. So we're following that same pattern. And you can see how this skin tone is already coming alive with this second layer of color. And then on her neck there. Okay, and now we're going to move on to E21, which was the next line up. Now remember, we did this type of blending from the side. So we're going to be doing that same thing, blending sideways, not flicking towards the center. Just going over some of these shadow areas to add that contrast back in. Okay, and then we have E11, which was the next shadow tone we were using. So again, just pulling this color from the side, just like that, and going over those previous areas we already did with the same color, just to give that contrast back and another layer of color. Okay, and then last but not least, our deepest shadow tone was our E04. We're just going to add right back in over those shadow areas. You can see this is going to reinforce those shadows. They got blended out a little bit. And this is where you're really going to see the contrast come back to your coloring. You don't have to do all the shadows, but you do want to hit a few of them so you have that difference in your darks and lights on the skin tone to give more form. And then along this right edge, and then again under the hairline. And then the little inner part of the ears, I'm just going over those with just a little dot. And there we go. Okay, so then lastly, I like to add some blush to the cheeks. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to be taking my RV21 and RV000, and this is how we're going to add this blush. I'm going to start with my RV21, and we are going to blend it out just like we did with our E00. We're going to be doing some small flicking motions, starting halfway through our darkest shadow, and we're just going to flick this color towards the center. It's going to look a little rough on the edges right now, but we are going to blend that out. So you just do a few little times going over to get your blushes as deep as you want, and then the same thing on the opposite side. Flicking your marker from the side there. Now we're going to take our RV000 and we are going to smooth out the edge. So just like I said not to do before, where you touch the very edge and blend it out, that's what we're going to do now. We're going to be touching on the side of the marker and just barely touching that rougher edge of the RV21 and then flicking it towards the center. And this is going to smooth out your blush there. So same thing on the opposite side. Going right over that color, and then you can take your your E000, and you can just finish blending out that center shadow one more time to blend through your highlight. And then if you want to increase the contrast on your skin tone, you can go over a couple of times over the blush area. If you want it even deeper on the edge, you could start with your RV04, which I'm going to add a tiny, tiny bit here. I want one more layer of color, so I'm going to start RV04 just along the edge there, and then I'm going to do RV21 one more time. So again, just adding a little bit deeper contrast there. Now I'm going to take my RV21 one more time. And again, I'm going to just go right over that previous area, just hitting that shadow tone there, blending it towards the middle, just like that. And then I'm going to take my RV000, and this is where I'm going to blend out this shadow towards the center. So same thing on this opposite side, coloring on the side of my marker to blend out the blush. And then I'm going to get my E00. I want to add a little bit more suntan to her, and this is just where I adjust with the skin tone. I'm just going to go over 1/3 time for the side of her face for the shadow. I want her a little bit more. Her face was a little bit too light compared to the rest of the body, and I really want her to look like my previous mermaid, so I'm just doing one more layer over that, and it's helping to blend out this blush a little bit too. So I'm just going right over the edge, flicking as I go, just adding a little bit more, color there. And then same thing underneath her neck. And then I can get my let's see, I think I'm going to do E11 and just go over the shadow area there. Just a tiny bit, got blended out. So this is just where you adjust. If you notice it needs a little bit more shadow buildup, you can easily do that. Just like that. Okay. And then one last time we're going to take our E0000, and again, just going right across our center of her face, just blending out any hard edges. This is the lightest skin tone blend, so if you see any rough spots, this is a great way to smooth out any areas you need without adding too much more color. Okay. So there we go. Now her skin tone is all done. We're ready to move on to her hair. So now we're going to start her hair with the pinks. I'm going to start with my RV29, and I'm going to start adding details to her hair. I'm going to be adding the pink highlights. So this is where you have these little hair strands. I'm going to be coloring on the tip of my marker. And I'm just going to follow what is already drawn there, just extending these slightly further. These little hairlines. So I'm starting at the middle of her part and then pulling these hairlines down. Just like that. And I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side, so I'm just turning this and then I am pulling these lines down, following the way her hair is. Then I'm going to turn this, and we did them from the top edge. Now we're going to pull these same lines from the side edge there, but we still want to leave some highlight dancing in between that. So we're not pulling it to connect it. So now I'm going to do the same thing on this opposite. This is RV29, yes. It is a reddish color, but it's gonna pop as hot pink once we layer the other colors over it. Okay, so again, just pulling these little lines, hair lines just like that. Now from the bottom of the hair, we're gonna pull some of these little strands, just a few little details. And I'm really just following what's already drawn there, just reinforcing those little lines. Just like that. Instead of RV29, I didn't see a previous comment. If you just have a dark, like a dark hot pink or a dark red, that would work just fine for this. You just want this as your shadow tone for the hair. Oh, whoops, and I already started doing that all pink. So this was supposed to be blue, that's okay. We'll go over that with the blue, so skip that part there, you guys. I was doing all her hair pink, and the bottom part I have blue. So I'm sorry. I get going and then... Okay, so we're just gonna pull these hairlines from this opposite side. Just like that. And then same thing from this side. Okay, now what we're going to do is I'm going to take my blue and I'm going to fix this bottom part of the hair so I don't keep blending that out in the pink colors, but that will be fine because it'll just look like a deep purple once we put the blue over it. So I'm going to be taking my B99, and that was my darker tone for my turquoise color, and I'm just going to go over these bottom lines I just did with it, and it's just going to make it look more like a turquoise or like a darker purple, which will be just fine. Because we wanted this kind of two-tone hair here. So just like that, and like we fixed it already. Okay, so now the same thing on this opposite side. You're going to have just a few of these little blue strands coming up. Just like that. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we are going to move back onto our pinks now that we fixed the turquoise area. And I'm going to be moving to my RV04. And for this, I'm just going to start at the hairline on the pink areas. I'm going to pull these lines right over the previous lines I just did. So you can see now it's making this kind of reddish color look more hot pink. I'm really not extending the line much further for this color. I'm just adding another blending layer over the lines I just drew of that pink. So same thing here on the underneath part of her hair. Just going over those same lines I just drew. And since this area is still a little bit wet from us just blending over it, it's going to just kind of spread out on its own without adding, you know, thicker lines, additional lines. You don't need to worry about that. Okay, so those were the top hairlines. I'm going to pull from the other side. I'm just pulling right here on the side of her head, re-going over those lines. And then the same thing on this bottom side, just going over those, just like that. So that was just another layer of color built up. Okay, so now we're moving on to RV21. And we're going to do the same thing going over these lines, but now we're going to extend these little lines just a little bit further. But in the areas where it's really small difference, we're not doing too much, we're kind of just going over the lines, but these areas, like where her hair's swooping down here on this side, we're making that line go a little bit further. We're going to do the same thing on this opposite side here. Following the lines we just did, going from either side, but still trying to leave a tiny bit of highlight. So here on the underneath part of her hair, we're pulling these lines down. And then same thing from the opposite side. Just like that. Okay, so now we're going to move on to RV10, which is the next color in this lineup. And we're going to do the exact same thing, just blending these pink strands. So we're just going over the previous lines, extending a little bit further. You're not going to see too much difference, but it is going to help smooth these sections together. Okay. And then last but not least in our pink area, we're going to be using RV000. And this is where we're going to add a few like longer lines into the blue section. Just pull those lines straight down. And it's going to help unify these two colors together as well. Okay. And now to make this hair really pop out, what I do is I go back with my first color, which was my RV29, and I just re-go over some of my darker contrast areas. So like my really detailed strands, since they did get blended out, you can see the lines kind of spread out a little bit as we added all those layers of color. I'm going to be coloring on the tip of my marker, and I'm just going over those tiny little details that I started with. Just those little sections of strands, I'm just re-adding those, re-going over them, and this is going to help redefine them again and give them a little bit more contrast. So same thing here on the underneath part of her hair. Just going over the ones I drew in the very beginning. And you can see it really makes this color pop as hot pink and gives some really fun little detail to this. Okay. I'm going to add just a little bit longer line here. I want this to kind of curve around there like that. And same thing on this little strand. I'm just trying to break up that little hairline that's swooping just a tiny, tiny bit. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the turquoise part of her hair. So we started with our B99 to do that bottom part. Remember, we went over where we started coloring it with the pinks. So the next color in that lineup is BG18. And here I'm just going to pull these strands just like we did before, but pulling them towards the pink. So again, just going over these lines, extending it just slightly further, but starting from the bottom layer. Be very careful not to draw into her arm there, but you still want to maintain that same form. So if it attaches to this area, you want to make sure you're following that same line. And then on this opposite side where her little seahorse is, we're just pulling that up towards the center. And then at the top part of her arm, I'm pulling some of those lines towards the top of her hair. Okay. And then now we're going to move on to our BG15 Aqua. And the same thing, we're going to just pull these lines a little bit further, going over them. Not adding new lines, just blending out the ones we just added at the beginning. And making them a little bit further. It's okay if they go a little bit into the pink. We actually want that. So you have that fun color transition. Oh, instead of second color, you could do it all pink if you want. If you don't want the turquoise, then just do what we did up here and then just do it the opposite direction with the pink. So just follow the same process. You could do this with purple. I mean, you really, it's limitless. Whatever color you want your mermaid hair to be, it works the same way. Okay, and then to finish with this hair, we're going to be using the BG10. And we are going to be just pulling this color up into the rest of that pink, just like we did the lighter pink. You want a few of these strands going up through both ways so it transitions between the two colors. So again, the colors for the blue was B99, BG18, let's see if we can get this, and this is the order I did them into, so B99, BG18, BG15, and BG10. So just like I did in my pink section, I'm going to take my darkest shadow color one last time. So I'm going to take B99, and this is where I'm just going to reinforce our little deepest shadow tones of the strands. So I'm just going over the original ones I drew in. Since they got blended out, you want to just add that right back in. And there we go. And then the last detail I really like doing on the hair, I'm just going to add now. We can add more details later, but I like to take a little gel pen, a jelly roll pen, and I like to add some little pearl details to mermaid hair. So here I'm just going to add wherever there is like some little shadows, just where you see that you want it. Just like 3 little dots and a little line there. Here on the inside of her hair, I'm going to add 3 little dots. You can add like a dot there, and then here, 3 there, and then 3 there. This little detail just gives some fun playfulness to her hair. And you can just kind of add those right in. Here too, on the top part of her hair. You don't want to overdo it, but you do want to add just a few. And you want to keep it consistent throughout. So if you add some to the right side, you want to add a few to the left. If you covered up some of your highlights, you want to add them back in. You could add them with the gel pen, just kind of go back in over to reinforce or to fix something. This is a great time if you go out of the lines. I use this a lot to fix any little, like this on the seahorse. I got a little bit of color onto him. I just pulled that through the top part of her shell. So this is a great time to kind of touch those areas up and readjust. So there we go. So now we have our mermaid hair all colored. Now we can go ahead and we can start with her tail and her seashells. Let's do her seashells actually next. That's a pretty easy little area to do. I'm going to start with C7. So for whites and like pearl colors, I always use my gray tones. So for this, I'm just going to do like what we did with the hair. We're going to go over these little shadow areas first and kind of add wherever these little shells kind of indent. We're just going to extend that line just slightly further with the tip of the marker. So same thing here on those little details, and then where these little shells curve, I'm just kind of flicking that from the side and pulling the shadow from either edge there. That was with C7. Okay, so now I'm moving on to C5. And I'm just going to start blending this out, so I'm going over those previous lines just like before. And this is just going to give another layer of color, and it's naturally going to kind of blend out on its own. Just like that. And that was C5. Now I'm moving on to C3. And at this point, I'm going to kind of dot in this color. So just like tiny dots like that, I'm going to do right here on the side. So where the shadow is, I'm just adding a couple of little tiny dots along all those shadow lines I did. This is going to give the illusion that it's kind of sparkly and that the color is broken up and you don't get just a solid layer of color, but you still get that shadow. So just a couple dots. I didn't actually draw in any of that. I just dotted right over those previous shadow areas. And then last but not least, I'm going to take my C1 and we're going to do the same thing with the dots, just right over that previous shading, still leaving white of the paper. Just dotting over those shadows. It's naturally going to make your eye like look through. It's going to leave little white specks through there. And you can see it makes it look like it's kind of sparkly, shimmery. And then I always take my darkest shadow tone one last time after I blend it out. And remember, I just go over the deepest shadow lines. So remember, we pulled those little lines on the edge of the shell, and then we extended those little lines on the bottom. And there we go, that's it for the white. Now we're going to do the same thing with her, the same colors, the turquoise color, and then the pink on her tail, and then pink on the inside of her little seahorse friend. So we'll do the pink first. I'm going to start with my RV29, which was my shadow color for my pink. And for this, we want these to be kind of shimmery, but we're going to do the same kind of thing we kind of did for the shells. So what I'm going to start with is just drawing my shadow lines first. So I'm just coloring in the shadows. So we're going to have like kind of a line along this edge of her tail with this pink, or with the RV29. And remember, we're doing this top half pink, so like this. The top half is going to be pink, and then the other side is going to be turquoise. And then here where you have this little, parts of her tail, these little like scalloped areas, we're just going to go right underneath the scallops there. But just halfway, because we only want half of her tail to be this pink color. So we're just adding that shadow underneath those areas, just like that. We're going to do the same thing on her little seahorse friend here. We're just going to pull the shadow line up along this side edge here. But this little cute girl seahorse, she has, we're doing her whole tummy pink. So we're going to pull these little lines from that edge, and we're just having them kind of curve around. We're not connecting it all the way. We're just curving from the edge to make it look like it's kind of turning. And then we're leaving this part empty. Okay, so now we're going to take the same color and we're just going to add a few little dots along the shadow lines we just did to break this up, so it doesn't look like a solid line. All I'm doing is dotting exactly over it, kind of randomly, but following the same pattern I did. So it's going a little bit out of the line, but not much. It's staying pretty close to my shadow line. And just using the tip of the marker, tiny, tiny little dots. So just like this, tiny little dots. And following where we mapped the shadows. So then same thing here on her little seahorse. We're just going to add those teeny tiny little dots right over our shadow line, staying as close to that shadow line as we can. And then same thing on the opposite side. Just like that. Okay, so now, just add one more there. Okay, so now we're going to move on to RV21. Right here. We're going to do that same thing like we had done before with these shells. We are going to just kind of dot over the area. So we're going to extend the line a little bit further. We're just dotting over the shadow first. So I'm literally just doing this, like that, just along the line, the tinier version of the dots. Just going over the shadow, extending it a little bit further into her tail area. And this is naturally going to leave some little white, sparkly, shimmery areas through her tail versus just blending, like flick blending through. Okay, and then same thing on her little seahorse. We're just dotting right over our shadow area, extending it tiny, tiny bit further. Same thing on the opposite side. Don't get too caught up on exact size of the dots or placement. I mean, just literally, all I'm doing is just letting my marker just tap the paper. Okay. And add just a couple here underneath her tail. Okay, and that was RV21. Now the next color in the lineup is RV10, and we're going to do that same thing. We're just dotting over this and extending it a little bit further. All of these layers of dots are going to add to the dimension, but then also blend out the previous color. So again, just dotting towards the center. Try not to go too far across our halfway point. Same thing here on her little seahorse. I'm just adding a few little dots just like that. Okay, then now that was RV10, so now our last color in this lineup is RV000. And this is where we're going to add one more layer. We're going to have a few of these overlap into our turquoise area so that when the color transitions between the two, it's more seamless. And then here between these sections, we're just going to kind of dot between all of those sections. Just like that for the little seahorse. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our turquoise color, and we're going to do the same thing from the opposite side. So I'm going to take my shadow color first, which is my B99, and I'm going to have the top part of her little tail here have a tiny little detail. I'm just going to pull a little line from that side, and then same thing on the opposite side, just a little tiny detail line. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the shadow. I'm going to pull our shadow line first along the edge of her tail. I'm going to pull these little shadow lines. So these are already drawn for you. We're just connecting them from the side and just having them follow the same curve of her little fins. And then on this bottom edge, you're going to have a tiny little detail. You're going to have a shadow where his little tail overlaps. So I just pulled that shadow there. And then on the inner part here, you're going to have a tiny little shadow. Just like that. And then here underneath her little scales, we're just going to pull that little line shadow on the underneath part of all those scales. On this edge, this left edge, and just a tiny bit of shadow underneath the top of her tail. Okay, so now remember we did the main shadow part. Now we're going to do our little dots. So just like before, we're going to stick as close to this line as we can, and we're just adding a few tiny little dots to break up this line. And I'm really coloring on the tip of the marker. This is adding our texture to her tail here. Just teeny tiny little dots following each of those little scales, shadow. Same thing here on the bottom of her tail. Now when we get to this area, we can add a couple little detail dots to her tail. I'm not really going over those shadow lines because I want this more like a smooth blend, not as so much like sparkly, thin. So I'm just adding a couple little detail dots to still keep with that same dotting pattern so it flows, but giving a little bit of difference. So just like that, just a few little dots in those areas. Okay, so now we're moving to the next color in that lineup, which again, remember, was BG18. And just like before, we are going to extend these little lines. So on the top part, this is more of a smooth blend. We're just going over either side, just pulling that color from the side. And then when we get to her tail, we're going to do the dots again. So we're just doing tiny little dots, extending it a little bit further and following our previous shading. And going over the shadow area of the deeper shadow. So see just tiny little dots and just make it kind of random, the shape and placement. Just like that. Okay, and then on the bottom part of her tail, we're going to just go over these lines like we did the hair. Just extending that shading just a little bit. And then we're going to do the same thing here on this bottom section of her tail, just expanding it just a little bit further, those lines, and then pulling that shadow around that edge there. I'm going to add just a tiny little detail line along that edge just to give it a little bit more interest. Okay, so now we're on to BG15. And just like before, we're going to pull from the shadow line, just kind of flick it towards the center on either side, still keeping it white in the center. And then remember the scales, we're just going to dot, expanding it a little bit further towards the pink. And going over our previous shadow color. Just tiny little dots. And we get to the tail, we're kind of flicking, at the bottom of the tail, we're just flicking over those colors, those previous ones, blending them out. Same thing with the opposite side. Pretty similar to how we did the hair. Okay, and then last but not least, we're going to be moving on to our BG10. And this is where we're going to flick from either side just like before, but now we're going to dot. Remember, we dot kind of into the pink too. So we're just dotting over our blue area and a couple of dots throughout the pink. Just like that. And then we're going to kind of connect a few lines on the tail, just pulling that color through. And now we have her little tail all done there. The last thing I do with the tail to make it sparkly is I take my gel pen, just like before with the hair, we're going to add, so for this, instead of dots, I'm doing more like little U's. Let me get a darker, I'm just going to show you with the marker really fast so I can show you what I'm doing with the gel pen. So I'm going to make little scallops like this, like just tiny little scallops. And sometimes I'll do a dot, but for the most part I'll be following this pattern to make it look like little scale shimmering. So I'm doing tiny little like U's and trying to keep it kind of over that darker shadow area because that's where this gel pen is going to show up the best. So I was just doing a few little U's, and then I'm going to add a few little dots just to break up that so it doesn't look so similar. Just a couple little dots. And you can see this tail already looks like it's shimmering, it's got scales. And now for the bottom part of her fins, we're just going to do a few little lines. So I just did them right underneath the lines that were drawn. So like this, like a few little lines and then a couple of dots just to pull through. And then the same thing on, now this little teeny little critter here, she's so small and we don't want, she's not going to have like scales like the mermaid tail does. So we're just going to add a couple little dots to that shadow area so it looks shimmery just like the mermaid. Okay, so then last but not least, we're going to color up our little seahorse friend. And so for her, we're going to be using purples. We're going to be starting off with BV08. And again, we're going to be pulling our shadow details. So we have here the top part of her little fin there. And then on the side, we're just extending these little lines that are already stamped there for you just slightly further. We're going to pull the shadow on the underneath part of her neck there. And then around her head and on the underneath part here. And again, this is BV08. This is our shadow for the purple. Where her hand overlaps, you're going to have a shadow. And then here underneath her little hand and around the side of her tail, this bottom edge of her tail is going to have that shadow. So we're just pulling that through. Here is going to be a little shadow. So we just added our shadows just like we did before. Now remember, now that we added our shadow, we're going to do the tiny dots again. So I'm going to go right over that previous line, adding teeny tiny little dots, breaking up that line shadow. And I'm dotting exactly where I put the previous line. So just like that, and I'm going to go through and just keep adding those little dots, teeny tiny, over the shadow lines we just did. This is such a small little critter, you just really need to keep your dots teeny tiny for this area. So again, just starting right over that. For the fins, we want to keep those more smooth, but we still want to keep them blending together with the dot pattern we're doing, so that's why I added a couple little dots randomly to that fin. Now this top fin, I'm going to do the same thing. Okay, so that was with BV08. The next color in the lineup for the purples is V09. And remember, I will repost all these colors after the live too. So if you guys miss any of these or can't find your notes for them, I will post that. So we're just adding a few dots over the previous dots, just like we did for the mermaid tail. And as you practice this, it'll get faster and faster for you. And then V05 is what's next. And again, just dotting over the previous dots and then just making them expand a little bit further into the rest of this little seahorse body. Just like that. Dotting over the previous and then making it go a little bit further. So here along the top part of her head, on the fins we're just pulling the lines just like we did for the hair, so we're just smoothly, instead of dots, we're just pulling those little detail lines. And then on the bottom of her tail, we're going to dot over the shadow just like before. Okay, so again, that was V05. Now we have V04. And just like before, just a few little dots. You don't need many for this little body, but you do want the variation. And that's how you get this sparkle look. So just dotting, expanding, still trying to keep some of the white highlight. Then we have BV01. We're almost done with coloring, you guys. So BV01, again, just dotting right through. Going over all the previous areas. Expanding more to the center. If you feel like it needs more blending, just go over the area with a few more dots. It just means you didn't go over your shadow area enough. You can see I still have the white of the paper right there. So let's see. Sorry guys, I've got like shadows coming in from the light. Hopefully you guys can still see that okay. Okay. And then here on the bottom of the tail, and then we're going to pull this color through the side as well. Just like that. Okay, so then last but not least, to dot over the rest of this area, we're going to be using our lightest for our purple tones, which is our BV000. And let's see if this helps. There we go. BV000, and this is where we're just going to finish dotting across our little critter here. Just like that. So just tiny little dots, blending out the rest of this across our highlight. But this is such a light color tone that it really blends it out. So there we go. And then remember, we take our gel pen, we're going to add a couple of little dots, sparkles to the shadow area of our seahorse. And a little goes a long way, so you just need a few. And then there you go. Okay, so our mermaid, she is all done. So I just had already previously cut her out. You guys would just fussy cut her right out of the paper. And a little tip for this little inner part area, you don't have to sit there and be so careful with the scissors. I literally just cut along this bottom edge of the tail. You see there how it's split? And then just cut out that center area. But then when you just go like that, it's like reattached. You can't even tell. So there we go. So now we have her all ready to go on our card. So now let's go ahead. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. We're going to finish assembling our card. So here we go. Let's zoom out. Tiny bit more. We have our background that we did at the beginning, remember? And look, now it's all dry. So it's good to use now. Okay, so in your kit, now we can go ahead and take out the pieces. You want to be really careful with those little pearls, remember, because they could fall out. I would probably say try to leave them in the bag until we're ready to add the pearls. You should have like 3 little teeny tiny pearls and then like a little mermaid gemstone. We're just going to set that aside. You're going to need all the rest of these pieces. So we're going to start with the bottom of the card. I have it in order from the top to the bottom. So we're just going to remove these top pieces. So where this gold piece is, you just lift this right up, set this aside. This is the front of your card. We're going to do the inside of the card first. So it should be this blue, sparkly, shimmery piece and the smaller white piece. And what you're going to do is take your Distress Oxide ink, the peacock feathers we used before, and just your blending sponge. I'm just going to quickly just ink the edges. This is not necessary. This is just something I like doing. And I'm going to go around the edges of this inside part where you could write. So just like that. And then I'm going to do the same thing with our blue shiny piece of paper. Just going right across the edges. Okay. And now we're going to take the inside of this card, this piece, and we're just going to adhere it to the middle of our shiny piece of paper. So you can do that however you prefer. I'm going to use liquid adhesive. You could use double-sided tape, whatever you prefer. Go ahead and adhere those 2 pieces together, centering this middle portion. So I'm using the Dry's Clear adhesive for mine. I'm just going around the edges. and adding a really thin layer of glue. And then I'm lining it up to the center of my card. I like using the liquid adhesive for this because if I use my double-sided tape, it never fills. I always get it a little bit crooked, and then trying to peel that up, it just can ruin the card. I'm going to use a brayer tool now that I'm happy with the placement. I'm going to just press down on this. I love using the brayer tools because it really gets the glue inside the card to be super even, and then it doesn't curl up on you. So I use this also a lot for mini albums as well. Okay, so now that's adhered. Now we can go ahead and you can take your card, make sure it folds with the longer fold at the top. We're going to just add this to the inside of our card. This is the inner portion, so I'm just going to get that same liquid adhesive and I'm going to glue this into the middle of our card. Okay, and then just lining it up. And these are already cut for you. They're inside your kits. Let's see, I already got it crooked. That's why I like using the liquid adhesive, because you can always readjust. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to use my brayer tool. Just like before, I'm going to press it down so we get it really nice and even and that the glue spreads out evenly underneath. And it doesn't warp or peel later. Okay, so there we go. So now our bottom card base is layered. Now we're going to start adding our top of the card elements. So for that, we're going to be taking, these are your pieces you had left over. We're going to start with our gold piece. The gold piece, we do not need to ink blend. You can if you want. If you do want to ink blend the edges, I would say probably Distress Ink in Vintage Photo go around the edge. So you would just do a quick layer of Vintage Photo, but it's up to you, it's optional. So then you take your liquid adhesive or preferred adhesive, just add it to the back, and we're going to add this right to the front of our card. So again, just lining this up to the middle of the card base. It's just going to be a tiny thin area. Oh, thank you. I'm happy you loved it. So again, just using my brayer tool to really get this even into the center of our card. Okay, so now the next layer is our polka dot layer. So now we can take this last pattern paper here. I'm going to leave those all to the side. This I'm going to use that blue peacock feathers to go around the edges. And then I'm just going to use liquid adhesive and then place it right in the center of my card. So I'm just going around the edges. Lining it up into the center and then pressing it down. Making sure I'm nice and even. Then using my brayer tool again to give some pressure and make sure that glue is adhered evenly and that I don't get any bubbles or creases in my project. Okay, so there we go. Now we can go ahead and start layering some of our die cuts. So you'll have this really beautiful mermaid tail right here. I'm going to add just some liquid adhesive to the back. Just a few little dots to hold it. You don't have to be super picky with it. I'm going to layer it at an angle. So it's just going to be kind of like this, coming off the edge. Just like that. And then I'm going to press it down. Now for this little section sticking off here, on my card, I went ahead and cut that off because I feel like it stuck out really far. So I'm just going to take my little scissors and I'm just going to fussy cut that little edge off there. Just so it's more even and I don't have that little piece sticking out. But that's up to you. You can leave it if you liked it. So there we go, just coming off the edge. So where I have it layered is just this top fin is coming off and then just a tiny little like 1/4 of an inch section coming off the side there. Then we are going to take, you have this chipboard piece right here. We are going to take our Vintage Photo Distress ink, and to get this kind of wooden texture I have on this card here, see how it has that wood grain? To do that is so super easy. You're going to take your chipboard, and you're going to take your Distress ink in Vintage Photo, and we're going to just remove the lid from the Distress ink, and you're literally just going to drag your ink pad across, and it's going to show up the texture of that chipboard, and it looks like wood grain. So same thing, I'm just rubbing it right across, just swiping the ink pad. You can do it as much as you want, as drastic of a vintage kind of photo you want, or vintage piece, but you can see all that wood grain showed up, and look how cool. So super, super easy. Now I'm going to take some foam tape because I want this to have the different layers like my previous card. So I'm going to take foam tape and just add a few pieces to the back. You could use scraps of cardboard. You could just glue it flat on if you don't want the foam tape. It's up to you. I'm not going all the way to the edges though, because we're going to still be nesting a few die cuts underneath. And this is strong enough that it will stay up on its own with just a few layers of foam tape. So again, just removing the backing. We are going to center this piece into the middle of our card. You could measure it out if you want. I'm just eyeballing it. So just like that. And then press down. Okay, so now you're going to take, you'll have a little shell bow piece. I'm going to take my Vintage Photo ink. I'm just going to hit the very edges of the shell with Vintage Photo. And same thing on the opposite side. And then I'm going to glue this, adhere it, just coming off the edge just slightly. So see how it makes like a little curve there where it's almost touching. That's about how far you want that. So I'm just going to add a tiny bit of adhesive to the back part of this little bow. And then again, leaving just a tiny little, like 1/8 of an inch from that edge, and pressing down. So now we have our next layer of the card. Okay, so now we're going to take that blended background, we did our ocean background, and I'm going to add foam tape to the back of this, just like we did for the top. Remember, we're going to add foam tape mostly to the middle, since we're still going to be nesting some other die cuts underneath. So just one layer of foam tape to the back of your blended ocean piece. Okay, so remember, we're going to have the purple on the bottom and the blue at the top. So like that. We're going to just layer this into the center of our frame, making sure it lines up with a little frame around all the edges, and press down. Just like that. And then we can take our little shell, and we're just going to add some ink from Vintage Photo, just like we did on the other shell. We're going to add a tiny bit of the liquid adhesive to the back of the shell piece, just on this right edge mostly, because it's going to be kind of sticking out on the side. And then I'm just layering it, kind of going out of the card like that. So just having it go off the edge. Then I'm just going to quickly cut a thin strip of foam tape. Just one little thin strip off of the roll, like that. And again, this is optional. It does kind of stay up on its own, but I like to add a little bit of reinforcement there. I am just going to put this right underneath. There we go. Like that. So then it has something, so if it gets pushed down in the mail, it's not going to bend. Okay. Now, let's see, we have our little bow. This is your like mermaid bow. Now there's two sides. There's a flat side and then there's a side with texture. This is the top part of your bow, the texture side. So we are going to be folding these in, but you want the texture side showing. So make sure when you fold these to glue that you have that edge showing. I'm just going to add a little bit of liquid adhesive to the middle, and I'm going to press that down into the center and just hold it. Then I'm going to get liquid adhesive on the other side, and I'm going to do the same thing. Just fold those little tabs to the center and then hold it down for just a few minutes. It takes just a second for it to hold, but you don't want it to pop open on you. And then you're going to take liquid adhesive to the middle, which right here in the back of the bow, and I'm just going to line it up here to the side of my card, just like that, on the very corner, and have it even with the same angle of your shell bow underneath. And we're just pressing that down so it holds. Now you're going to take your sentiment. You have your little sentiment here, make a splash. Oops. And you also have another little sparkly border. You're just going to, I'm going to ink the edges of this first with my peacock feathers. And then I'm just going to glue it into the center of that little rectangle. So this little rectangle here, I'm just gluing this to the middle. Just like this, lining it up and pressing it down. Okay, so then I'm going to take one strip of foam tape and I'm just going to add it mostly to this right edge because I'm going to have it kind of going off the edge slightly. So like that. I'm going to bring my card back over here, and where there you have your little stitched line, I'm going to line this up with the stitch line halfway between. So in the very center of this is where I'm going to start my sentiment, and then I'm going to line it up with the stitched edge. So I make sure I get the right angle on that, and then press it down. So now it's adhered there. Okay. Now we can take inside your little bag, you'll have this larger mermaid embellishment. They're all different colors, so don't worry if yours is not exact the same color as mine. They are a rainbow of colors, so whatever fun one you got is going to look beautiful. Make sure your little scallops are facing down, and then add liquid adhesive or foam tape, whatever you have, pop dots into the center of your bow. And then press your little jewel into the center. Now dries clear glue glues really fast, so it will be pretty quick before it's held, but if you have a different type of adhesive, you may have to hold it for a few minutes. You may have to set something on top of it to help it hold better. Okay. So now we have one last thing to ink blend, and then we can add our mermaid. So we have our little starfish. We are going to be taking Distress ink and carved pumpkin and just a blending sponge. We're going to shade this with the Distress ink just like we did the background or anything else. I'm just going to load up my little blending sponge. I'm going to do small circular motions. I'm going to have it blend to white in the center. So I'm starting off on each little arm of this seahorse, starfish. And just like before, I'm keeping the concentration of color deeper on the edges and lighter in the middle. So again, just blending up towards the center and doing the same thing on all of these little arms of her little ocean friend here. Now if you want it less contrast, you can always pull the color across, swipe a couple times to blend it so it's a more even tone if you like that better. And you can always build up the color too. So that's all I was doing there, is just building up that orange. And now our little seahorse is, or our starfish is all colored. So I'm going to quickly just clean up this ink so it doesn't transfer onto our card. And now we can take our card base, and we're going to have this nested on the bottom part just behind the shell. So we're going to take just a little bit of liquid adhesive, just like before, just add a tiny bit to the back. And then you're just going to nest this right behind, just like that, and press down. Okay, now we can add our beautiful mermaid that we colored. I love to add them with foam tape, and I always do 2 layers of foam tape on the back so that they pop up just a little bit higher than everything else, and so that she's a star of our show. So I'm just going to take 2 layers of foam tape. The easiest way to do that is just cut a piece. I'm going to cut it in half. She's on pretty strong paper, so she doesn't need a lot. And then I'm just going to cut this in half. So we have 2 double-sided pieces, 2 little double-sided squares. I'm just adding that to the back of our mermaid right now, and removing the backing. Then all I'm going to do is take my card, I'm going to line her up, and I'm going to have her right here on this right edge. I don't want her directly center. I'm going to press her right down. And now the last thing we're going to do is add our last little pearl embellishments. These are wherever you feel like you want them, but you should have 2 or 3 little tiny pearls in your bag. These little shimmery pearls. And be very careful, they're very easy to get lost. They're so little. And the easiest way to get these on, they do not have self-stick adhesive. You do have to add adhesive to them to get them to stick. They do not have a sticker backing. Get them out. Okay. And these are just kind of wherever you want them. So the easiest way to do this, I'm using like a little jewel picker here. This has like a wax top, so it makes it easier to grab these little guys. But I'm going to take the adhesive, and I'm just going to place a dot of my liquid adhesive where I want the little gem to be, and then I'll use my little jewel picker to put it there. So like right here where I have my little starfish, I want one of those there, so I'm going to add a dot of glue there. I think like right here on the bottom part of the bow on the ocean, I want one there, and then up at the top of my sentiment. I always do them in odd numbers if I'm adding little embellishments like this, like pearls. I do 1, 3, 5, but I never do like 2. Okay, so now I'm just going to take my little jewel, well, just going to quickly add it right on top. And of course these are being really difficult today. Okay, so we are just going to finger place these. So we're just going to just set them right on top of that glue. Just like that. Same thing here. And then our last one where our sentiment is. Get this little guy. So just like that. And there we go. Our card is totally done inside and outside. So we have our two cards here. But now you guys know how to create this, and I can't wait to see what you guys create. Thank you so much for joining me today, you guys. I will see you guys again soon. Please share in the group when you finish your project. I would love to see. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.